In the study of complex systems, the 11 negated triads provide a powerful framework for understanding the intricate relationships and influences between elements. Each triad, equilibrium, feedback, reversion, retrospective, exclusive, bottlenecked, dissonant, divergent, division, disassociation, and disintegration, offers a unique perspective on how the absence or presence of one element can affect the entire system. By examining the logical structure of these triads, we can gain insights into the dynamics of interconnected systems. To illustrate the application of these triads, we can look at examples from the Book of Revelation, where the symbolic relationships between various entities vividly demonstrate the principles of these triads. The equilibrium triad explains a system where the absence of each element is balanced with the absence of the others. The first relationship shows that if the first element is absent, the second element is also absent. The second relationship extends this balance to the third element, showing that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the third. Finally, the third relationship demonstrates that the absence of the first element implies the absence of the third, completing a balanced state where the absence of any element is mirrored by the absence of the others. In chapter 2 of Revelations, the church in Ephesus, the Nicolaitans, and the lampstand illustrate a state of equilibrium. The church in Ephesus is criticized for leaving its first love, which is associated with a distancing from the Nicolaitans' teachings that corrupt it. This absence of the church's initial devotion implies a lack of influence from these false teachings. The Nicolaitans' absence, in turn, means that the threat of the lampstand being removed is prevented, as repentance and rejection of false doctrines would avoid this consequence. Thus, the absence of the church's first love and the absence of the Nicolaitans' influence together imply the absence of the removal of the lampstand, reflecting a balanced state where the absence of any negative element is mirrored by the absence of others. The equilibrium triad teaches the importance of maintaining balance by recognizing how the absence of negative influences can lead to a harmonious state. In the metaphor of the church in Ephesus, the Nicolaitans, and the lampstand, the church's loss of initial devotion, absence of A, diminishes the corrupting influence of the Nicolaitans, absence of B, which in turn ensures the lampstand remains, absence of C. This triad underscores that addressing one negative element can mitigate others, highlighting the interconnectedness of elements in sustaining a balanced, positive state. The feedback triad illustrates a system where negative conditions propagate in reverse order. The first relationship shows that the absence of the second element causes the absence of the first. The second relationship indicates that the absence of the third element causes the absence of the second. The third relationship completes the cycle, showing that the absence of the first element causes the absence of the third, creating a feedback loop where the absence of each element results in the absence of the next in reverse order. Chapter 4 provides a vision of the throne, the 24 elders, and the 4 living creatures that demonstrates a feedback loop of negative conditions. If the 24 elders cease their worship, this implies the absence of the central throne's authority, as their continuous worship reinforces the significance of the throne. Additionally, if the 4 living creatures stop their praise, the 24 elders would also cease their worship, since the creatures initiate the cycle of praise. Consequently, the absence of the throne's authority would lead to the absence of the 4 living creatures' praise, illustrating a feedback loop where the absence of each element results in the absence of the next in reverse order, emphasizing the interconnectedness and dependence of their roles. The feedback triad illustrates the cascading effects of negative conditions propagating backward through a system. In the vision of the throne, 24 elders and 4 living creatures, the cessation of the elders' worship, absence of B, diminishes the throne's authority, absence of A, leading to the cessation of the creature's praise, absence of C. This feedback loop emphasizes that the absence of one element can reinforce the absence of others in reverse order, teaching that continuous, positive reinforcement of each element is crucial to maintain the system's integrity and prevent negative spirals. The reversion triad explains a system where negative conditions trace back to a prior state. The first relationship shows that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the first. The second relationship shows that the absence of the third element implies the absence of the second. The third relationship indicates that the presence of the third element implies the presence of the first, creating a reversion where the absence of each element traces back through the system. But the presence of the last element implies the initial element's presence. In Chapter 6, the four horsemen, war and famine, depict a system of reversion where negative conditions trace back to a prior state. The red horseman brings war, so the absence of war implies the absence of the red horseman's influence. Similarly, the black horseman brings famine, meaning the absence of famine implies the absence of the black horseman's impact. However, the presence of famine introduced by the black horseman implies the presence of the white horseman who precedes it in the sequence of events. This reversion shows how the absence of each element traces back through the system, but the presence of the last element in the chain implies the initial element's presence, illustrating a progression of judgments. The reversion triad emphasizes the return to prior states through negative conditions, highlighting the cyclical nature of actions and consequences. The sequence involving the four horsemen, war and famine, demonstrates how the absence of war, absence of B, indicates the absence of the red horseman's influence, absence of A, and the absence of famine, absence of C, implies the absence of the black horseman, absence of B. However, the presence of famine, C, implies the presence of the preceding elements, illustrating that the reappearance of a negative condition can revive previous states, teaching the importance of addressing root causes to prevent cyclical issues. The retrospective triad illustrates a system where negative states are linked retrospectively. The first relationship shows that the absence of the third element implies the absence of the first. The second relationship indicates that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the third. The third relationship shows that the presence of the third element implies the presence of the first, creating a retrospective path where the absence of each element implies the absence of the one before it, but the presence of the final element implies the initial element's presence. Chapter 8 describes the 7 trumpets, the first trumpet, and the vegetation in a retrospective manner. The first trumpet's judgment leads to the burning of a third of the trees and all green grass. Without this trumpet sounding, there would be no vegetation burning. Furthermore, the absence of the first trumpet implies no initiation of this destructive event. Conversely, the presence of the burning vegetation directly results from the first trumpet's judgment, establishing a retrospective relationship where the absence of each element implies the absence of the one before it. But the presence of the final outcome implies the initial action's presence. The retrospective triad teaches the concept of retrospective causality, where the absence or presence of outcomes can be traced back to earlier actions. The 7 trumpets, particularly the first trumpet and the resulting destruction of vegetation, show that without the trumpet sounding, absence of B, the destruction wouldn't occur, absence of C. The presence of destroyed vegetation, C, implies the initial action of the trumpet, A. This triad highlights the importance of understanding the origins of outcomes and how early actions can have significant retrospective impacts. The exclusive triad explains a system where the absence of elements results in exclusive outcomes. The first relationship shows that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the first. The second relationship indicates that the absence of the third element implies the absence of the second. The third relationship shows that the combined absence of the first and second elements implies the absence of the third, illustrating an exclusive system where the absence of multiple elements leads to the absence of another. In Chapter 10, the mighty angel, the little scroll, and the mystery of God form an exclusive system. The angel presents the little scroll, and without it, his declaration is incomplete. The scroll contains the mystery of God, so without revealing the mystery, the scroll's purpose is nullified. The combined absence of the angel and the little scroll implies that the mystery of God will not be revealed. The exclusive triad illustrates how the absence of multiple elements results in the absence of another, emphasizing the necessity of interdependent components. The scenario with the mighty angel, the little scroll, and the mystery of God shows that without the angel and the scroll, absence of A and B, the mystery of God remains unrevealed, absence of C. This triad teaches the importance of the presence of all necessary elements to achieve a specific outcome, highlighting the exclusive nature of interdependent actions in achieving comprehensive results. The bottlenecked triad explains a system where negative conditions create a bottleneck effect. The first relationship shows that the combined absence of the first and third elements implies the absence of the second. The second relationship indicates that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the first. The third relationship shows that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the third, illustrating a bottlenecked system where the absence of one element constrains the absence of others. In Chapter 12, the woman, the child, and the dragon depict a bottlenecked system where negative conditions create constraints. The woman gives birth to the child, and the dragon seeks to devour it. Without both the woman and the dragon, the child's existence and its threat are nullified. Furthermore, the absence of the child implies the absence of the woman, as her role is defined by giving birth to the child. Similarly, the absence of the child implies the absence of the dragon's pursuit, as the dragon's role is in direct response to the child's birth. The bottlenecked triad emphasizes how the absence of one element can constrain the presence of others, creating a bottleneck effect. The depiction of the woman, the child, and the dragon shows that without the woman and the dragon, absence of A and C, the child's existence and its threat are nullified, absence of B. The absence of the child, absence of B, implies the absence of both the woman and the dragon's roles. This triad teaches the critical nature of each element in enabling the system's overall function, illustrating how bottlenecks can hinder progress and outcomes. The dissonant triad illustrates a system where negative states create discordant relationships. The first relationship shows that the absence of the third element implies the combined absence of the first and second elements. The second relationship indicates that the absence of the second element implies the combined absence of the first and third elements. The third relationship shows that the absence of the first element implies the combined absence of the second and third elements, illustrating a dissonant system where the absence of each element implies the absence of the others. Chapter 14 presents the 144,000, the Lamb, and the new song, creating a dissonant system where negative states lead to discordant relationships. The 144,000 sing a new song before the Lamb, and without this song, their unique relationship is absent. The Lamb's presence is central to the 144,000 and their song, so the absence of the Lamb implies the absence of both the 144,000 and the new song. Similarly, the absence of the 144,000 implies the absence of the Lamb and the new song. The dissonant triad reveals the discordant relationships created by negative states, where the absence of one element implies the combined absence of others. The relationship between the 144,000, the Lamb, and the new song shows that without the new song, absence of C, the unique bond between the 144,000 and the Lamb, absence of A and B, dissolves. The absence of the Lamb, absence of A, leads to the absence of the 144,000 and their song. This triad underscores how the lack of harmony in one aspect can disrupt the entire system, teaching the necessity of maintaining all elements to preserve unity and coherence. The divergent triad explains a system where negative states lead to divergence. The first relationship shows that the combined absence of the second and third elements implies the absence of the first. The second relationship indicates that the combined absence of the first and third elements implies the absence of the second. The third relationship shows that the combined absence of the first and second elements implies the absence of the third, illustrating a divergent system where the combined absence of elements leads to the absence of another. In Chapter 16, the seven bowls, the earth and the sea, illustrate a divergent system where negative states lead to divergence. The 7 bowls plagues are poured onto the earth and sea, so the combined absence of these elements implies the absence of the plagues. The absence of both the 7 bowls plagues and the sea implies the absence of the earth being affected, as the plagues impact both. Similarly, the combined absence of the earth and the 7 bowls plagues implies the absence of the sea being affected. The divergent triad explains how the combined absence of elements leads to divergent outcomes, emphasizing the interconnection of multiple components. In the case of the 7 bowls, the earth and the sea, the absence of the 7 bowls plagues and the sea, absence of A and C, results in the earth being unaffected, absence of B. The absence of both the earth and the bowls plagues, absence of A and B, implies the absence of the sea being impacted. This triad highlights the significance of each element's presence in creating a holistic impact, teaching that the divergence of components can weaken the overall system's efficacy. The division triad explains a system where negative states create divided outcomes. The first relationship shows that the combined absence of the first element and the presence of the second element uniquely determines the absence of the third element. The second relationship indicates that the combined absence of the second element and the presence of the third element uniquely determines the absence of the first element. The third relationship shows that the combined absence of the third element and the presence of the first element uniquely determines the absence of the second element, illustrating a system where relative absences create divided interactions. Chapter 18's depiction of Babylon, merchants, and shipmasters forms a divided system where negative states create divided outcomes. The fall of Babylon causes mourning among merchants and shipmasters. If Babylon and the merchants are absent, the shipmasters' mourning is nullified, as their grief is tied to Babylon's influence on trade. Similarly, the combined absence of merchants and the presence of shipmasters imply the absence of Babylon's influence, as the shipmasters' mourning is connected to the merchants' trade with Babylon. The absence of shipmasters and the presence of Babylon imply the absence of merchants' trade. The division triad shows how relative absences create divided interactions, leading to distinct outcomes based on the absence or presence of elements. In the fall of Babylon, the merchants and the shipmasters, the combined absence of Babylon and the merchants, absence of A and B, nullifies the shipmasters' mourning, absence of C. The absence of merchants and the presence of shipmasters, absence of B and presence of C, imply the absence of Babylon's influence, absence of A. This triad teaches the impact of selective absences on outcomes, illustrating how divisions within a system can alter its function and results. The dissociation triad explains a system where negative conditions lead to dissociated outcomes. The first relationship shows that the combined absence of the second element and the presence of the first element uniquely influences the absence of the third element. The second relationship indicates that the combined absence of the second element and the presence of the third element uniquely influences the absence of the first element. The third relationship shows that the absence of the second element implies the combined absence of the first and third elements, illustrating a system where negative conditions create dissociated interactions. Chapter 20 presents the dragon, the nations, and the lake of fire in a dissociated system where negative conditions lead to dissociated outcomes. The dragon deceives the nations, leading to their eventual judgment in the lake of fire. The absence of the nations and the presence of the dragon imply the absence of the lake of fire's finality, as the dragon's deception leads to this judgment. Similarly, the absence of the nations and the presence of the lake of fire imply the absence of the dragon's deception. The absence of the nations implies the absence of both the dragon's deception and the lake of fire's judgment. The dissociation triad highlights how negative conditions lead to dissociated outcomes, where the absence of elements influences the presence of others uniquely. The relationship between the dragon, the nations, and the lake of fire shows that the absence of the nations and the presence of the dragon, absence of B and presence of A, imply the absence of the lake of fire's finality, absence of C. The absence of nations, absence of B, leads to the absence of both the dragon's deception and the lake of fire's judgment. This triad teaches how disassociation within a system can lead to disparate outcomes, emphasizing the need for cohesive interaction among elements. The disintegration triad explains a system where negative conditions lead to disintegrated outcomes. The first relationship shows that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the first, with a possible presence of the third element. The second relationship indicates that the absence of the second element implies the absence of the third, with a possible presence of the first element. The third relationship shows that the absence of the second element implies the combined absence of the first and third elements, illustrating a system where the absence of the second element leads to disintegration across the system. Chapter 22 describes the river of life, the tree of life, and the throne of God in a system of disintegration where negative conditions lead to disintegrated outcomes. The tree of life is nourished by the river of life, so the absence of the tree implies the absence of the river. The tree and river symbolize the divine presence, so the absence of the tree also implies the absence of the throne of God. The absence of the tree implies the absence of both the river of life and the throne of God. The disintegration triad emphasizes the disintegration of outcomes due to the absence of critical elements. The depiction of the river of life, the tree of life, and the throne of God illustrates that the absence of the tree of life, absence of B, leads to the absence of the river of life, absence of A, and the throne of God, absence of C. The absence of the tree implies the absence of both the river and the divine presence. This triad teaches the critical importance of each element in maintaining the system's integrity, showing how the loss of one component can lead to the disintegration of the entire system. Through the vivid and symbolic visions of Revelation, the end triads illuminate a tapestry of interconnectedness and balance that underlies the apocalyptic prophecies. Whether illustrating equilibrium among the church, Nicolaitans, and the lampstand, feedback loops among the throne, elders, and living creatures, or the reversion of conditions heralded by the four horsemen, each triad offers a lens to view the intricate and often cryptic relationships within the text. By dissecting these relationships, we gain a deeper understanding of the delicate interplay of spiritual and temporal forces, highlighting the delicate equilibrium, feedback, reversion, and disintegration that shape the ultimate destiny portrayed in Revelation. This exploration not only enriches our comprehension of the biblical text, but also provides a compelling narrative that captures the profound interconnectedness of its elements.